I'm painting this portrait of Polly just outside of my studio in the south of France on a warm and sunny December morning. First thing, just with some very diluted paint, is to mark in the compositional drawing. So a few lines there just to mark the contours of the head, which gives me how big I want to do it to fit onto the canvas. Because if you just start with a bit of detail and work your way out, you can't be exactly sure how big the composition is going to end up, and that might not be the way you want it. Firstly, it might not fit on the canvas, or secondly, it might leave too much space around the head and look strange to be too small for the canvas. So I always start with the parameters of the head, just as a very rough guideline, and then, as you can see here, start putting in some colour and some proportional measurements. So just looking where the eyes will be, nose and mouth, and putting on some light and dark warm colours for the face, and start to build up an idea of the different forms within the composition. At this moment, I'm not really connecting too much to the sitter, in this case Polly. I'm just really just taking the proportions and the colours and tones as I see them abstractly, without really thinking too much of what I'm trying to do with them, because the most important thing at this stage is to obviously get the drawing right and get the proportions right. Without that, there can't be any connection to the subject. So that's all I'm thinking of at this stage. And then at a later time, and not always while I'm in front of the sitter, sometimes a few days later, for example in the studio, I might start to look at it and contemplate it a little bit more and try to get a little bit more of the personality of the sitter into the composition. That can be done in front of the sitter, but not always, because sometimes it's better to do it in a session a little bit later. So if the sitter can come back a week later, ideally. If not, then I'll do it from memory and photographs. So now you can see I'm putting on some stronger lights there. We're in a lot of sunshine and there's a lot of light around. Even the shadow side of her face is very light. But that shadow is useful and very important, because without the dark there is no light, and without those dark there is no definition of the features of the face, like eyes, eye sockets, nose, cheeks and mouth. They're all revealed by the observation of light. Whatever expression happens to come out, or in this case I'm just looking at the eyes and thinking about the way they look. Whatever happens at this stage doesn't really count very much, and I fairly much just ignore it, and to allow myself just to concentrate on the bigger picture. Everything is about the bigger picture at this point. And if you are tempted and distracted to go into some sort of detail, it definitely, in my experience, leads to regret later on. So I resist always the temptation to go into detail at this point. As you can see, I'm just working with light and colour, seeing how far I'm going to push those highlights on her face. There. And measuring those against the darker areas. And of course those highlights and those darker areas are at the same time defining all the forms. It's a constant process of measuring the depth of tones and colours, and as you put them on, watching very carefully that the proportions of each form that you place actually is correct to the subject that you're painting. And occasionally you get a little bit of a bit of character in the brushstroke. So some of the brushstrokes you do start to make you feel like you're putting character into it and give you a suggestion of how the painting might be heading. But at this early stage that's not so important, and it really shouldn't be anywhere near a priority. It should be, in fact, almost ignored and not do too much of that, because any brushstroke that you put on now that you fall in love with and say, oh, I really like that, the way that brushstroke went on, means that you will try to work around that brushstroke all the time and not touch it. And that it is a restrictive way of painting. It means that you're building up the picture full of areas that can't be touched, and that restricts the freedom to just treat the whole as a whole and be able to just adjust it free of any restrictions. Only when you can see the whole thing pulling together in a diffused way of looking, without looking at any particular area in a focused way, just seeing the whole thing and saying, okay, that's more or less the correct proportions and lighting and colouring, then you can start to get down to detail. Of course you can do detail before then, it's just very risky. It means that it'll be wasted time and will frustrate you when you want to change it, and might stop you changing it, which is even more frustrating, and of course then the picture can never work out.
Mais quelque chose qui soit à la portée de tout le monde aussi, parce que oui, voilà. On ne peut pas mettre encore une boulangerie. Vous avez vu à la mairie, quand on est français, pour installer une boulangerie. Les Américains prennent l'habitude de manger du pain.
Comment il s'appelle? Pas le roi, il fait français, c'est forcément pas. Mais d'abord, il a envoyé tous les matins, il a envoyé des croissants.
Comme je suis allée, c'est quand je suis allée normalement. Il y a des sites de l'argent, là c'est l'argent, oui, mais voilà, donc le boulangerie c'est différent. S'il y a un endroit qui est... Oui, mais moi je vous dis, moi le truc c'est l'alimentaire. L'alimentaire c'est quelque chose qui n'a pas eu. Vous voyez ce que je veux dire? Tout ce qui est
Here the light has gone off her face. We're a bit later on in the session. The light has gone off her face, and it is affecting the way I see it, because actually I like to some degree the evenness, but what it's making me think is just to lighten some of the shadow areas, just to give a little bit of evenness and light to it, because it's a very light sunny day. And that's the sort of decision you're making once you start thinking about the character of the picture rather than the detail and forms and colours, when you're just trying to say, well, what feeling do I get from this? Here I'm in the studio now. This is a couple of weeks after, and I just want to put a few touches to this to develop the character as I remember it and as I see it, because I've got a photograph of her obviously, and I've got all this video that I've made while I've been painting her, so I can look back on the previous session and just go around, and it's just a few touches here and there. I've textured the hair a little bit, and I'm now just working on a little bit of detail in the eyes and the mouth and the lighting, which I was talking about. I want it to look very light, this picture. I think that perhaps I've got Polly looking a little bit more serious than she comes across in real life, and that is a common thing to happen when someone is sitting for you for about an hour, because no matter how smiley and happy they are, it's hard to have that coming across constantly as you sit to have your portrait painted. You tend to sort of, most sitters tend to lose that that smiley happiness, and often portraits do lean a little bit towards the more serious side of someone, I always find. But I'm just softening this out. I think I've got a look in her eye which I'm happy with, which says something about her inner happiness and her character, and that's perhaps the main thing for me. I can see it in the eyes. I've given the earrings just a little bit of extra sparkle. The one on her right ear, the one on the left side of the painting, is actually in sunlight, so that's really, I've given that quite a lot of sparkle. And cooler colours in there to the skin tones, which gives it the right sort of contrast to work. And otherwise I'm finished.